Imagine a stretch of years when rain seemed to forget entire regions of Europe, when wells dropped lower each month, when fields turned pale, and when communities had to rebuild their routines just to make it through another season. Tonight's calm journey takes us back to one of the longest dry spells recorded in medieval memory, a drought so persistent that people later referred to it simply as the Seven-Year Dryness, a period that reshaped daily life in slow, quiet ways. Before we begin, if you enjoy these peaceful walks through forgotten chapters of history, make sure to like the video and subscribe. It really helps this channel grow, and it lets me know you want more calm stories to fall asleep to. And if you've ever lived through a summer that felt unusually dry, share your experience in the comments. I'm always curious how modern days compare to the challenges of the past. Now, settle in, get comfortable, and let's drift back to a time when the sky remained clear far longer than anyone expected, and the rhythm of life had to slow down to match the heat of the land. Most great historical turning points arrive suddenly. A storm that hits overnight, a cold wind that sweeps through a valley, or a flood that transforms a river in the span of an afternoon. But the Seven-Year Drought began differently. It did not announce itself with dramatic force. Instead, it unfolded so slowly and subtly that few people recognized its arrival until it had already become part of their daily lives. This chapter explores the quiet beginning of that long, steady dryness. The first mist rains, the early signs in fields and wells, and the moments when communities realized that something unusual was happening, even before they understood how long it would last. The earliest hints came in the form of delayed spring rains. In many regions of Europe, farmers relied on predictable patterns. Winter brought steady moisture, spring delivered reliable rainfall, and early summer carried scattered showers. These rhythms shaped nearly every aspect of life: planting schedules, travel plans, market arrangements, and even household routines. When one season arrived slightly out of order, it caused inconvenience. When 2 or 3 seasons shifted unpredictably, it caused concern. But when the pattern broke for several years in a row, it challenged the basic expectations that communities had depended on for generations. In the first year, the changes were modest. Farmers noticed that fields dried faster than usual by mid-spring. Seeds planted in prepared soil took longer to sprout. Wells that normally filled during winter and early spring remained lower than expected. Many people assumed the weather was simply going through a normal fluctuation. Communities were used to years with slightly more or slightly less rain. They planned around variations with confidence that the next season would return to the familiar pattern. Spring festivals were held as they always were. Carts rolled into markets filled with early vegetables, though quantities were slightly smaller. Shepherds guided flocks across hillsides and noted the color of the grass changing earlier than usual, but they did not consider it a major issue. Travelers moving between towns simply found the roads drier and firmer, which made movement easier. Even household tasks remained unchanged, except for the small tendency of water supplies to run lower toward the end of each day. By midsummer of that first year, however, the pattern became noticeable. Rivers receded enough to reveal stones usually hidden beneath flowing water. Shallow ponds across farmland shrank to patches of muddy earth surrounded by dry reeds. Water carriers in towns walked slightly longer routes to reach functioning wells. Small details like these formed part of the collective early awareness, not alarming, but unusual enough to enter local conversations. Agricultural workers were often the first to sense that the pattern might not correct itself quickly. They recognized the way soil behaved under prolonged sunlight. The earth became harder, losing its usual moist weight. Wooden plows creaked more than expected when pulled across dry ground. In certain regions, farmers adjusted planting techniques, spacing out seeds to reduce competition for moisture. These adaptations reflected generations of practical knowledge. Farmers were used to working with the land and knew that small adjustments could make the difference between a modest harvest and a difficult one. Still, few imagined that the dryness would continue longer than a season. People believed the rains would return in autumn, as they always did. But when autumn arrived, the clouds remained high and thin, offering only brief drizzles that barely darkened the soil. Puddles dried within hours. Roof tiles that normally glistened after rainfall remained dull. Roof gutters, which usually carried water along the edges of houses, stayed nearly silent throughout the season. In the second year, the signs became harder to dismiss. communities began noticing longer-term effects. Wells that had dipped lower the previous year took even longer to refill. In households relying on shared wells, people started organizing water collection times more carefully to prevent overcrowding. The water drawn grew slightly warmer by afternoon, a sign that the underground reserves were thinning and had less depth to keep temperatures cool. Fishermen who depended on small rivers and streams observed changes as well. Certain stretches of water that normally supported small fish species became shallow enough for stones to break the surface. Nets needed to be cast differently, and boats in shallow rivers scraped on unseen rocks. In lakeside regions, the shoreline crept back by small but noticeable distances, leaving docks raised above the receding water. The landscape itself began to shift in quiet ways. Meadows once lush with grass turned a lighter shade earlier in the season. Forest floors became less damp, changing the smell of woodland paths. Travelers who moved through these forests observed the crunch of leaves underfoot earlier in the year than they remembered. While none of these changes posed immediate danger, they contributed to an emerging awareness that the environment was responding to a prolonged absence of rain. By the time the third year began, communities could no longer treat the dryness as a temporary pattern. Markets reflected the shift through subtle changes in supply. Baskets of vegetables still arrived, but the sizes were smaller. Herbs that normally appeared in abundant bundles were brought in tighter bunches. Vendors placed their goods carefully to make displays appear full even when supplies were limited. Grain still reached the market, but farmers stored them more cautiously, trying to stretch reserves longer. Households also adjusted their daily routines. People began using water more thoughtfully, rinsing tools with smaller amounts, washing linens less frequently, and storing water in clay vessels designed to reduce evaporation. Inns placed smaller bowls of water for travelers to wash their hands. Kitchens adapted recipes to ingredients that required less water to prepare. Bakers, who typically relied on water for dough preparation and oven maintenance, adjusted their methods to conserve it. Even the simple act of watering small household gardens required planning. Animals felt the change as well. Cattle and sheep grazing on open land had to be moved more frequently because grass shrank earlier in the season. Herds tended to cluster near remaining natural water sources, creating busier paths along riverbanks and streams. Farmers built shaded areas to protect animals from prolonged sunlight. Those responsible for tending livestock noticed subtle shifts in behavior as animals sought cooler spaces and reduced their activity during hotter hours. In towns and villages, people began discussing the possibility that the dryness would persist. Older members of the community recalled past years when rain had been scarce, but few could remember a period that remained so dry for so long. Their recollections formed part of the collective understanding of what was happening. People relied on these memories to guide decisions, even though the dryness was becoming more prolonged than previous episodes. Travelers brought news from other towns, confirming that the pattern was widespread. Reports indicated that distant valleys, farmlands, and coastal regions were experiencing similar conditions. Streams were lower across wide territories, and communities in different regions described the same quiet concern. This shared awareness helped people prepare gradually rather than suddenly, giving them time to adjust before the drought deepened further. One of the most significant early changes occurred in the way people scheduled their workdays. Because the air remained hotter and drier for longer periods, many workers began adjusting their routines to earlier hours. Farmers preferred working in the morning before the ground lost its remaining moisture. Vendors arriving in town for market day often traveled even earlier to avoid the heat of midday. Households performed tasks involving heat, such as baking, cooking, or washing, during cooler parts of the day. This adjustment reflected a subtle shift in daily life, shaped by environmental conditions rather than social expectations. Communities also became more attentive to sharing information. When someone discovered a particularly reliable well or a shaded path that retained moisture longer, this knowledge became valuable. People discussed weather patterns more frequently, noting the behavior of clouds, wind direction, and the smell of the air. Although they lacked modern measuring tools, they observed natural signs carefully, drawing on generations of experience to understand what might come next. Despite these changes, the atmosphere of early drought years remained mostly calm. People adapted gradually, managing the dryness with practical adjustments. Markets still operated, Households still cooked meals, and workers still followed their routines. The drought had not yet reshaped life dramatically, but it had begun influencing the rhythm of everyday activities in ways that would become more significant as the years continued. What makes the beginning of the 7-year drought historically interesting is the quietness of its arrival. There were no sudden events, no dramatic warnings, only a gradual shift that grew clearer month after month. Each year, without significant rainfall, made the next year's dryness more noticeable. Communities recognized the pattern not through sudden crises, but through small, accumulating signs. This slow progression is what allowed the drought to last as long as it did. People adapted enough to manage each stage without panic, even as conditions grew more challenging. Their routines changed quietly, their decisions became more cautious, and their awareness deepened with each passing season. By the time the drought reached its middle years, the environment had changed enough to reshape entire regions. But those changes began with the subtle, almost unremarkable early years described in this chapter. This gradual beginning sets the stage for the deeper transformations explored in later chapters. The adaptations of communities, the shifts in agriculture, the role of trade routes, the evolution of market supply, and the ways people found stability in a slowly changing world. But to understand the full story of the drought's impact, it is essential to begin with these quiet early years, when the sky changed just enough for people to notice, but not enough for them to imagine how long the dryness would truly last. As the drought moved into its second and third years, the slow changes that had first appeared in year 1 became impossible to ignore. People who had initially explained the dryness as an unusual season or a momentary shift in the weather began to recognize that the pattern was stretching far longer than expected. The arrival of year 2 marked a turning point, not because anything dramatic happened all at once, but because the familiar rhythms of daily life no longer aligned with the environment around them. Small inconveniences became persistent challenges. Seasonal expectations no longer matched the behavior of the sky, and communities, scattered across regions but connected by shared experiences, slowly realized that the dryness was not simply passing through. It was settling in. The first sign that the drought was becoming long-term appeared in the fields. Farmers, who typically adjusted to weather changes with remarkable skill, noticed that their usual strategies no longer produced the results they expected. In year 1, spacing seeds farther apart had helped reduce competition for the little moisture available. In year 2, however, this same tactic produced only small improvements. The soil, already stressed from a previous dry season, lacked the deeper moisture reserves needed to support crops through their growth cycle. Even well-prepared fields showed signs of fatigue. Soil that had once been rich and dark appeared pale and dusty earlier in the season. The arrival of spring rains had long been a dependable event, shaping planting schedules for generations. By the second year of the drought, these rains came later and carried less water. Light showers passed through quickly, barely settling on the ground. Farmers watched as moisture evaporated almost immediately, absorbed by a land that had become thirsty after months of minimal rainfall. Planting still occurred out of necessity, but communities worked with an adjusted sense of expectation. Crops grew, but slower, with less vigor. Growth that once filled fields with strong stalks now produced shorter, thinner plants. By year 3, entire regions saw these patterns repeat themselves. Farmers adapted again, turning to crops known to tolerate dry conditions a little better. Barley, which demanded less water, became more common in certain areas. Some communities reduced the size of their fields, focusing on soil that retained moisture more effectively. Others experimented with planting dates, hoping that slightly earlier or later schedules might align more closely with short-lived rain showers. These changes demonstrated the resilience of agricultural communities, but they also reflected the growing acknowledgement that the dryness was not temporary. Towns and villages felt the drought's effects through their water systems. Wells, which had dipped lower in year 1, now struggled to refill between uses. In year 2, households began establishing informal schedules to reduce early morning crowds around shared wells. People drew water carefully, sometimes storing it in clay vessels lined with cloth to slow evaporation. By year 3, many wells had dropped below traditional markers that older residents remembered from their own youth. It wasn't that they ran completely dry. In most places, some water remained, but the reduced depth forced communities to change the way they organized their routines. Travelers who moved between towns carried news of these changes, revealing that the decline in water levels was widespread. Reports described rivers flowing more slowly, lakes receding noticeably, and streams separating into small channels instead of running as continuous bodies of water. These consistent accounts helped communities understand the drought's broader scale. It wasn't just a local issue or a regional irregularity. It was a condition stretching across multiple territories. Markets began reflecting these realities in more tangible ways. Vendors who once arrived with abundant baskets now carried smaller loads. Vegetables lacked the plumpness typically seen in normal seasons, and herbs were bundled in more modest groups. Grains remained available, but were brought to market with greater caution. Sellers saved more for their own households, unsure how future harvests would turn out. Buyers began noticing these small changes, adjusting expectations accordingly. People discussed the dryness more openly, sharing observations on field conditions, well depths, or local water sources. Yet despite these changes, markets did not fall into disarray. Vendors maintained professionalism, arranging their goods thoughtfully to preserve the appearance of variety. Skilled sellers displayed smaller goods in ways that maximized visual appeal, spreading items evenly, using clean cloths, or placing complementary products next to each other. The market square still filled with activity each morning, but buyers spent more time comparing goods, asking vendors about conditions in the countryside, or making decisions with greater care. Inns and households adapted in quieter ways. Recipes changed subtly to accommodate ingredients that were less abundant. Meals requiring extended simmering were prepared less often because they consumed too much water. Instead, kitchens favored dishes that used smaller amounts of liquid and relied on herbs or grains that remained available. For travelers staying at inns, breakfast still arrived on time, though portions reflected the new reality of limited produce. Innkeepers became especially attentive to managing water for cooking, cleaning, and maintaining comfort for guests. Livestock owners felt the drought's progression keenly during years 2 and 3. Grazing land dried earlier than usual, forcing shepherds to rotate flocks more frequently. In some regions, herds were guided to higher elevations where moisture remained slightly more accessible. In others, small water basins were dug to collect runoff during rare showers. Livestock remained healthy overall, but their routines shifted significantly. Farmers took note of which fields produced enough grass to sustain grazing and which areas became too dry to support even short-term feeding. Communities also grew more deliberate in managing natural resources. In many towns, small groups of residents agreed informally to monitor local streams or shared wells. These individuals observed water levels, recorded changes, and reported updates during market days or community gatherings. While these observations were simple and lacked modern precision, they provided important information that helped residents plan for the weeks ahead. The act of monitoring itself demonstrated the shift in perspective. People no longer assumed that water would naturally replenish at familiar rates. Even social routines began adjusting. Events typically scheduled for late spring or early summer shifted slightly to cooler parts of the day. Outdoor gatherings moved earlier or later to avoid heat, and markets began seeing a small increase in early morning buyers. Households set aside times for collecting water rather than doing so casually throughout the day. These incremental adjustments reflected a deeper recognition that the dryness affected not just fields and wells, but the entire rhythm of community life. Although the drought grew more noticeable in years 2 and 3, people still maintained calm, steady approaches to their challenges. The tone of daily life did not become frantic or alarmed. Instead, routines adapted thoughtfully, shaped by cooperation and shared understanding. Neighbors helped each other identify efficient ways to manage water, care for livestock, or adjust household habits. Towns with multiple wells coordinated usage more effectively, ensuring that everyone had access to enough water for essential tasks. This collaboration reflected the long-standing resilience of medieval communities, which were accustomed to responding to natural variations with practical wisdom. The most striking aspect of these early drought years was how they encouraged communities to think long-term. In the absence of weather predictions or detailed scientific knowledge, people relied on observation, memory, and collective experience. Older residents shared stories of past dry spells to offer perspective. Farmers compared conditions across fields and regions. Travelers exchanged updates from distant towns. These conversations helped communities understand that the drought was not a short-lived inconvenience, but a prolonged change requiring steady adaptation. One of the subtle yet significant developments during years 2 and 3 was the shift in how communities valued water. What had once been taken for granted became a resource requiring thoughtful management. People cleaned equipment more carefully to avoid unnecessary waste. They reused rinse water for other tasks when possible. Households stored water in shaded areas to reduce evaporation. Even simple acts, such as washing tools or preparing meals, took on new meaning as water became a resource handled with greater respect. Markets played a central role in shaping this shared awareness. Vendors who traveled from countryside regions provided valuable insights about water sources, crop conditions, and field moisture. Buyers asked questions that helped spread information across communities. Through these interactions, the market became a center of communication as much as commerce. It connected households, farms, and entire regions through a steady exchange of observations that shaped how people responded to the drought. By the end of year 3, communities understood that they were living through a significant event. They had not yet seen the full impact of the drought, but the signs were unmistakable. Wells remained chronically low. Fields produced smaller yields. Water carriers traveled farther. Market supplies grew more modest. And yet life continued with quiet determination. People woke early, worked steadily, and relied on one another to manage the slow intensification of the drought. What distinguishes years 2 and 3 from the later years is the tone of adaptation. These were not years of crisis. They were years of understanding. Communities were learning the extent of the drought, adjusting routines, and preparing quietly for what lay ahead. They had enough resources to manage the challenges, but they understood that continued dryness would demand even greater resilience. Their calm response reflected the strength of traditional knowledge, the adaptability of agricultural society, and the collective discipline that defined medieval life. This period formed the foundation for what would come later, the middle years of the drought, when the dryness fully settled into the land and reshaped the way entire regions managed water, work, and daily life. But before those deeper changes unfolded, communities first had to recognize that the drought was not temporary. That realization, gradual, steady, and universal, defined years 2 and 3, marking the moment when people began preparing themselves for a challenge far longer and more enduring than they had anticipated. By the 4th year of the drought, the dryness had moved beyond being an unusual weather pattern or a long inconvenience. It had become a part of everyday life. Communities no longer hoped the next season would restore the old rhythm of rain and growth. Instead, they accepted that the land had settled into a new pattern, a slower, warmer, and more demanding routine that touched nearly every aspect of living. Years 4 and 5 marked the middle stretch of the 7-year drought, a period when the dryness shaped decisions, redefined expectations, and quietly reshaped the structure of daily life across towns, villages, and farmlands. The most visible changes appeared in the landscape. Fields that had once been dark and rich after winter rains now remained light-colored and powdery well into spring. Soil that normally held moisture deep below the surface became more shallow in its ability to retain water. Farmers inspecting their fields in early morning hours noticed that even pre-dawn coolness failed to hide the dryness that had settled deep into the earth. Footsteps left more dust behind, and plow blades gathered dry soil instead of turning moist layers. These subtle details told farmers that the land had not recovered during winter as it traditionally did. By the 4th year, communities had completely revised their planting schedules. Instead of depending on seasonal rains, farmers began relying on small reserves collected from wells or streams. They planned smaller fields with more careful spacing. Some regions reduced their agricultural land significantly, choosing only the sections that retained moisture best, often the areas closest to natural low points in the landscape. Farmers selected crop varieties known for tolerating dryness, even if these varieties were less profitable or less commonly used in previous years. Livestock management also shifted. Shepherds began guiding flocks along longer routes to reach areas where grass still grew steadily. Communities dug small water-holding basins in natural hollows to capture rare rainfall. These basins were simple, earthen depressions lined with compacted soil, but they provided enough moisture to keep livestock watered on long grazing days. Farmers placed greater emphasis on shade, building small structures, or using clusters of trees to protect animals during hotter months. Livestock still lived healthy lives, but their routines reflected the steady drying of the land. In towns and villages, the fourth and fifth years brought a new kind of order to water management. What had begun as informal scheduling during the earlier years now solidified into consistent routines. People visited wells at predictable times, forming small morning and evening queues that moved efficiently. Individuals carried water in slightly larger clay vessels lined with cloth or straw to reduce evaporation. Households saved rinse water from washing produce to use in gardens or for cleaning tools. Families stored water in cooler parts of their homes and built simple barriers to protect containers from direct sunlight. These practices, though modest, became daily habits that helped communities handle the dryness effectively. By year 4, water carriers became more important figures in towns. These individuals traveled to wells or streams at scheduled hours, gathering water for households unable to make the trip frequently. They used sturdy wooden yokes to balance buckets and moved along familiar routes through towns and marketplaces. Their presence reflected the way towns had adjusted, efficiently, calmly, and with a shared understanding that cooperation was the key to navigating prolonged dryness. During these years, markets showed noticeable but organized changes. Vendors arrived with smaller quantities of produce, but displayed it thoughtfully to maintain a sense of abundance. Grains were sold in measured amounts, often in smaller sacks. Herbs appeared in compact bundles rather than wide spreads. Fresh vegetables were fewer in number, but handled with greater care, as vendors understood the importance of preserving every item. Market squares still filled with activity each morning, but buyers took more time selecting goods, often comparing bundles and asking vendors about conditions in the countryside. People began to talk about the drought not as an interruption in their lives, but as part of the environment they now lived in. Conversations during market days included discussions about distant wells, traveling shepherds, new planting methods, and the condition of grazing land at different elevations. News from travelers became an essential resource, providing insight into how other towns were coping. This shared communication helped communities refine their approaches, borrowing successful practices from neighbors and adapting them to local conditions. Water sources beyond wells also grew more important during years 4 and 5. Communities with access to rivers organized their days around collecting water from points where the flow remained steady. People recognized which parts of a riverbed retained moisture longest, and these areas became reliable gathering points. Small pathways leading to these water sources developed more solid footing due to frequent use. Families living nearby sometimes maintained these paths, removing loose stones or trimming overgrown plants to ensure safe movement during early morning or evening hours. The architecture of towns adjusted subtly as well. Wooden gutters were repaired more often to capture even small amounts of rain from rooftops. Households placed clay barrels beneath them to collect runoff. Gardens shrank slightly in size, focusing on plants that required minimal watering. Shaded sections of courtyards became valuable space for storing water or protecting produce before it was brought to market. Another significant development during these years was the way communities approached food preservation. People became more attentive to drying produce, creating stable stores that required no additional water to maintain. Fruits and herbs were dried in shaded areas, where airflow preserved their quality. Grains were sealed in containers lined with cloth to keep them from losing moisture. Households adapted recipes to ingredients that could be stored longer or required minimal water to prepare. Inns, which served travelers moving across regions, also adjusted to the drought's middle years. Innkeepers became skilled at balancing water use, allocating enough for cooking, washing, and serving guests without overusing reserves. Guests traveling from distant areas often carried small containers of water with them, reflecting the widespread nature of the drought. Inns provided water for essential tasks, but encouraged travelers to be thoughtful about consumption. Meals remained satisfying, but relied more on ingredients that held up well under dry conditions. The drought's middle years also influenced trade routes. Merchants traveling between towns paid greater attention to where water sources were located along their journeys. Some routes became more commonly used because they passed through areas where wells remained deeper. Others saw less traffic when travelers found it difficult to access reliable water. These shifts occurred gradually, driven by practical needs rather than formal decisions. Eventually, merchants began timing their departures based on when they could reach water points at predictable intervals. Daily routines across regions became more structured. Early morning hours grew especially valuable because they offered cooler temperatures and slightly higher moisture levels. Farmers worked fields at dawn. Water carriers began their routes before sunrise. Vendors arrived at the market square earlier to prepare their goods efficiently. Even households shifted tasks to this early part of the day, cleaning tools, preparing meals, and organizing produce for market before the heat grew stronger. This widespread shift created a calm, synchronized rhythm across towns and farmland. Despite these notable changes, the tone of daily life during years 4 and 5 remained steady and composed. People were accustomed to adjusting their routines based on natural patterns, and the drought simply required more attentive adjustments. Communities leaned on familiar structures, cooperation, communication, and careful planning. There were no sudden disruptions or dramatic actions. Instead, people adapted thoughtfully, recognizing that calm, steady management was the key to navigating prolonged dryness. By the middle of the drought, people had also begun to reflect on the early years with clearer perspective. They realized how much conditions had changed since the first subtle signs appeared. What had once been minor adjustments had become daily habits. What had been temporary measures had become established routines. This awareness shaped how communities approached the future, understanding that the dryness might continue for several more years and preparing accordingly. One of the most important characteristics of years 4 and 5 was patience. Not passive patience, but the kind of steady resilience shaped by experience. People understood the environment well enough to anticipate dusty summers, low water levels, and reduced harvests. This expectation allowed them to make practical decisions with confidence. They stored more thoughtfully, planted more strategically, and shared information more frequently. They organized tasks around cooler hours and used natural shade effectively. Each of these actions, while small on its own, contributed to the broader stability of community life. The middle years of the drought also revealed the adaptability of medieval society. Without modern tools or scientific knowledge, people relied on observation and cooperation to manage a long-term environmental challenge. They understood the land intimately, recognized patterns through lived experience, and adjusted without panic. This steady response kept markets functioning, fields productive enough to sustain communities, and daily life structured around resilience rather than fear. As year 5 drew to a close, the dryness showed no signs of reversing. The land remained pale. Wells remained modest. Fields produced smaller yields. But people had created a new balance, a routine that allowed them to continue living, working, and trading despite the persistent dryness. This quiet restructuring of daily life is what defined the drought's middle years. It was not a period of crisis, but a period of adjustment, shaped by calm determination and collective understanding. These years formed the heart of the drought, the time when people no longer waited for change, but learned to live within the new conditions. Their adaptations would prepare them for the final years to come, years filled with continued dryness, but also with the strength of routines refined through experience. By the time the drought entered its 6th year, the dryness had become so familiar that many people struggled to remember what the land had looked like before it began. Entire routines, expectations, and household habits had been reshaped quietly over the previous 5 years. What had once felt unusual had now become ordinary, and the 7th year would bring that reality to its quietest and most settled form. These final 2 years of the drought did not bring sudden hardships or dramatic scenes. Instead, they represented the slow, steady endurance of communities that had learned to live within a changed environment. People had adjusted so thoroughly that the dryness, though still difficult, no longer disrupted their sense of order. The landscape in year 6 reflected the accumulated effects of the earlier years. Fields that had once recovered slightly during cooler months no longer showed that brief renewal. Soil remained pale throughout the year, never fully regaining its deeper moisture. Farmers had grown accustomed to preparing their fields long before dawn, taking advantage of every moment when the earth was cool enough to work comfortably. Seeds were planted with the precision of experience, spaced widely to give each sprout the best chance of capturing the small amount of moisture available. Farmers no longer experimented with different planting schedules. They had already learned which days, which methods, and which varieties offered the most dependable results. By this point, entire regions had shifted toward the hardiest crops, those that required minimal water and produced reliable yields even under dry conditions. Barley and rye had become more common, replacing crops that demanded deeper soil moisture. Vegetables such as onions, leeks, and certain root plants became staples because of their ability to grow under challenging conditions. Farmers accepted smaller harvests, focusing on quality rather than quantity. Their knowledge, shaped over 6 years, allowed them to plan harvests with confidence even when the land offered only modest support. Water management reached its most refined stage during years 6 and 7. Wells that had remained stable throughout the drought became central to community life. People knew exactly when wells refilled slightly overnight and when water levels dropped due to steady use. Households organized water usage with precision, timing certain tasks to cooler hours when evaporation was slower. Clay vessels used for storing water were repaired frequently, ensuring their surfaces remained intact. Many households adopted the habit of storing water in shaded corners or underground spaces that maintained cooler temperatures throughout the day. Communities had also become skilled at capturing every small amount of rainfall. Even brief drizzles triggered quick, well-practiced routines. Barrels were rolled into position beneath rooftop gutters. Clay pots were arranged along eaves. Courtyards were swept clean before rain so that collected water remained usable. People no longer waited for large storms or significant weather changes. They had learned to value every droplet. Even if rainfall produced only a thin layer of moisture, communities worked together to capture it, store it, and distribute it thoughtfully. During these middle years, the market continued to function smoothly, though with a different appearance than before the drought. Instead of wide baskets overflowing with produce, stalls displayed smaller, carefully arranged quantities. Vendors placed items in ways that preserved freshness and emphasized quality, lining vegetables in neat rows, spacing grains in evenly shaped piles, and displaying preserved goods that remained stable even during long dry periods. Buyers, now fully adjusted to the drought, approached market day with practicality and patience. They spent time examining goods closely, not because supplies were unpredictable, but because long-term dryness had reshaped what fresh meant. Grain vendors sold smaller sacks, often explaining how far the grain had been transported or how the fields had been managed. Herb sellers offered compact bundles dried carefully in shaded areas. Potters displayed vessels designed specifically for water storage, thicker walls, narrower necks, and shapes that minimized evaporation. These items became particularly valuable, and many households purchased them to replace older or less efficient containers. Livestock routines reached a new normal as well. Shepherds had long adapted to the drought by moving flocks along extended routes. By years 6 and 7, these routes had become so established that people referred to them by name. Certain hillsides and riverbanks, known for retaining moisture a little longer, became common grazing grounds. Shepherds timed their travel with impressive precision, knowing exactly how long each area could support their flocks before grass became too sparse. Watering points had become community landmarks, places where shepherds exchanged news, shared practical tips, and observed how the landscape changed from season to season. Households had reshaped their daily habits so thoroughly by year 6 that managing dryness felt natural rather than burdensome. Kitchens prepared meals that required less water, relying more on grains, dried herbs, and produce capable of long storage. Families grew smaller gardens that emphasized efficient watering practices. Clay pots were placed in corners that remained shaded throughout the day. Windowsills became home to herbs that tolerated dry air. In many towns, small courtyards were redesigned to maximize shade, using cloth coverings or tall plants to reduce heat. Even the rhythms of work had shifted permanently. Early morning hours had become the most productive time of day for nearly every profession. Farmers worked their fields before sunrise. Bakers prepared dough earlier to take advantage of the cooler air. Water carriers began their rounds before dawn. Market vendors arrived earlier and set up stalls before the heat intensified. Craftsmen planned tasks requiring careful detail during morning hours, reserving simpler tasks for the afternoon. This collective shift in daily scheduling helped communities remain efficient even within the persistent dryness. Travelers experienced the drought's effects differently than in earlier years. By year 6, routes were well understood, including which wells retained the most water and which towns had stable supplies. Inns became central stopping points, valued for their steady access to water and their ability to accommodate travelers who planned their journeys carefully. The presence of water barrels outside inns signaled reliability, and travelers often shared insights about distant regions while resting in shaded areas. These exchanges contributed to a broader understanding of how widespread the dryness remained. Trade itself remained stable, though slower and more deliberate. Caravans carrying grain, pottery, preserved foods, and cloth moved between towns according to schedules shaped by water accessibility. Merchants traveled during cooler parts of the day, stopping at known water sources overnight. These journeys relied on coordination among communities, which provided information about water levels, road conditions, and resting points. Commerce did not decline dramatically. Instead, it adapted to the environmental rhythm established by the drought. One of the most striking aspects of years 6 and 7 was the calmness with which people accepted their reality. By this point, the drought had shaped the identity of entire communities. Children who had grown up during these years knew no other climate. Adults had become skilled at managing water, planning harvests, and adjusting routines. Elders remembered wetter years, but even they acknowledged that the dryness had lasted long enough to become a defining part of the landscape. Despite the long duration of the drought, people maintained steady cooperation. There were no abrupt changes or dramatic decisions, only thoughtful adjustments, refined over years of experience. Households shared water when wells dipped lower. Farmers encouraged one another with small insights about soil conditions or planting strategies. Market vendors offered practical suggestions about storage and preservation, and supported travelers with thoughtful guidelines about water use. Shepherds coordinated grazing routes to avoid overusing fragile fields. This collective effort ensured that the final years of the drought passed with remarkable stability. In year 7, the dryness settled into its most predictable form. The landscape, though pale and dusty, no longer changed dramatically. Wells remained modest, fields produced steady but smaller yields, and routines continued with quiet discipline. People no longer spent time wondering when the drought would end. They simply lived within its boundaries, trusting their experience and the strategies refined over the previous 6 years. This acceptance did not mean resignation. It reflected resilience. Communities had proven their ability to adapt, to reorganize their lives around new environmental patterns, and to maintain steady, meaningful routines even under prolonged dryness. The final year of the drought demonstrated the depth of medieval society's quiet strength. People lived calmly, worked efficiently, and supported one another through habits that had become second nature. These 2 years represented the culmination of everything communities had learned since the drought began: patience, cooperation, thoughtful planning, and reliance on shared routines. They had reshaped their daily lives with remarkable steadiness, preparing themselves not just for survival, but for continuation, a collective understanding that even prolonged dryness could be navigated with calm, steady discipline. When rain eventually returned, as described in later chapters, communities welcomed it with gratitude, but they carried forward the habits shaped during these final years. The drought had lasted long enough to redefine normal life, and what people built during years 6 and 7 formed the foundation for how they approached the world even after the sky finally changed again. After 7 long years of dryness, the return of rain did not arrive with dramatic storms or sudden, overwhelming downpour. Instead, much like the drought itself, the change came quietly, a gradual shift that people barely noticed at first. When moisture finally returned to regions that had grown accustomed to dusty roads, pale soil, and careful water management, communities found themselves adjusting again, not with the surprise of crisis, but with the cautious optimism of people who had learned patience. This chapter explores the slow recovery that followed the 7-year drought, how the first rains arrived, how the land responded, and how medieval towns and villages rebuilt their routines around the return of moisture. The first sign of change appeared not in the sky, but in the air. One early morning, before dawn had fully arrived, People noticed that the breeze carried a faint hint of coolness that had not been present in previous years. It was subtle, just enough for bakers on their way to heat their ovens to pause briefly and take note. For most of the drought, the air had held a constant dry warmth, especially during the warmer seasons. But on this particular morning, even those accustomed to waking early sensed that the air felt slightly heavier, as if carrying moisture from far distances. As dawn reached the edges of rooftops, clouds appeared that differed from the thin, high formations seen throughout the drought years. These clouds were lower, denser, and moved slowly across the sky. Farmers preparing to work their fields watched them carefully. Shepherds guiding livestock to early grazing paused on hilltops longer than usual. Market vendors walking toward the square glanced upward with quiet curiosity. No one announced anything outwardly. After 7 years of dryness, people had learned not to expect sudden change, but the presence of clouds nevertheless settled into community conversations that morning. The first rain was light, almost hesitant. It arrived during an early afternoon when many people were indoors preparing meals or working in shaded courtyards. A soft pattering sound touched rooftops, surprising enough for households to momentarily set aside their tasks and step outside. It wasn't enough rain to soak the ground. Instead, it formed scattered droplets that darkened small patches of earth before evaporating. Still, even this small amount of moisture held significance. Children placed their hands under the faint drizzle. Adults watched the sky with measured optimism, knowing that a single shower did not signal the end of a multi-year pattern, but it did hint at something changing. In the following days, the pattern repeated. Light showers appeared irregularly, never enough to replenish wells or revive fields, but enough to demonstrate that the atmosphere itself was shifting. Clouds gathered more frequently. Breezes carried cooler undertones. The land responded modestly. Thin layers of soil grew slightly darker after each light shower, and the smell of moisture, faint but unmistakable, drifted through fields and forest paths. People chose to observe quietly, avoiding heavy expectations, but they could not ignore the change in the air. As weeks passed, the showers grew steadier. Villages that had long depended on wells observed that water levels rose slightly overnight. It wasn't dramatic. The increase was barely noticeable at first, but communities carefully monitored it. People visited wells at dawn and measured levels with the same precision they had developed during the drought. The slight rise brought an unusual sense of calm, not excitement, but reassurance. Routines continued as usual, but with the awareness that something long absent might be returning. When the first real rain arrived, it came during the early hours of the morning. Clouds gathered densely the night before, and lanterns reflected their weight as people moved through nighttime routines. Just before sunrise, a steady patter began. Not a roar, not a storm, but a continuous, gentle rainfall. For the first time in years, the sound of water landing on rooftops created a rhythm that filled the air. Vendors walking toward the market paused under awnings. Farmers listened from the edges of their fields. Shepherds postponed early grazing briefly. The quiet confidence of the rainfall signaled that the long dryness might finally be loosening its hold. The land responded with slow determination. After 7 years of dryness, soil had become compact, losing much of its ability to absorb water immediately. The first steady rains formed small pools on the surface rather than sinking deep into the earth. Soil needed time to soften and regain structure. People understood this through experience. They knew that recovery would not be immediate. After prolonged dryness, the land responded cautiously, just as people did. It absorbed moisture little by little, each shower preparing the earth for the next. In the weeks that followed, the steady rains continued. Streams that had narrowed into thin trickles broadened slightly. Shallow riverbeds developed gentle movement again. Moss began appearing on shaded stones. Grass grew faintly along field edges. Shepherds noticed that grazing routes improved just a little each week. Farmers observed deeper soil moisture when they pressed their fingers into early morning earth. These small, slow changes signaled the beginning of recovery. Communities approached this recovery with the same patience they had developed during the drought. People did not rush to return to pre-drought routines. Instead, they allowed the environment to guide their decisions. Farmers waited to observe several weeks of rain before adjusting planting schedules. They recognized that soil needed time, seasons, not days, to rebuild moisture reserves. They continued planting smaller fields at first, spacing seeds widely as they had learned during the drought. But they also began testing small sections of land with slightly denser planting, paying attention to how the soil responded. Wells offered some of the clearest signs of recovery. People monitored water levels with the same careful attention used during the drought. They marked daily changes, compared notes with neighbors, and observed the relationship between rainfall and well depth. By the second month of steady rains, wells remained fuller in the mornings, enough for communities to reduce the strict scheduling routines that had shaped water collection for years. People no longer needed to rush at dawn. Households visited wells throughout the day with confidence, knowing that reserves were slowly rebuilding. Markets reflected this recovery gradually. Vendors brought more produce, though not in large quantities. Vegetables had improved color, herbs grew more vibrantly, and grains arrived in slightly larger sacks. These small improvements brought a renewed sense of activity to the market square. Buyers noticed the change immediately, often commenting with quiet appreciation rather than celebration. After years of scarcity, communities treated the return of variety with respect shaped by long experience. The recovery also influenced livestock routines. Grass returned to grazing areas slowly but steadily. Shepherds shortened routes, no longer traveling as far each day to find pasture. Water sources used by flocks became more reliable. Livestock regained steady grazing rhythms that required less intervention from farmers. The animals themselves appeared more relaxed, moving at familiar paces rather than searching persistently for moisture-rich plants. Households also modified routines as rain returned. Kitchens reintroduced dishes requiring more water, though cautiously. Gardens expanded slightly, focusing on plants that responded well to newly softened soil. Water carriers found their work growing easier as wells remained fuller and households required fewer long-distance trips. Clay vessels used during the drought continued to be used, but now with less careful rationing. Life did not return immediately to its pre-drought form, but it began shifting gently in that direction. The psychological shift among communities was subtle but profound. For 7 years, people had built their lives around scarcity, planning carefully, conserving resources, and adjusting schedules. The return of rain introduced the possibility of a new rhythm, though people were mindful not to expect sudden abundance. Instead of rushing to rebuild old habits, communities allowed the environment to lead the transition. The rainfall brought relief, but the habits developed during the drought, patience, observation, cooperation, remained strong. One of the most significant aspects of the recovery was the understanding that change takes time. The drought had lasted long enough to reshape not just landscapes, but expectations. People no longer assumed that favorable seasons would last indefinitely. They approached the return of rain with balanced optimism, appreciating each shower while continuing to manage resources thoughtfully. Their experience taught them that the environment could shift gradually, and that preserving stability required collective awareness. Trade routes also adapted slowly. As water sources improved along travel paths, merchants resumed longer journeys. Inns replenished their water supplies more easily, attracting more travelers. Markets saw increased activity as goods from distant regions became more accessible again. But even these shifts occurred with the same steady rhythm as the rain itself. Not suddenly, but consistently. By the time the seventh year concluded, communities recognized that the drought had finally begun to release its hold. Fields regained deeper color. Wells reflected increasing depth. Market supplies expanded. Livestock followed familiar grazing paths with renewed confidence. The landscape, once pale and dry, began showing signs of resilience. But the most lasting change occurred within the people themselves. They carried forward everything they had learned. The importance of steady routines, the value of cooperation, the necessity of careful planning, the role of observation in understanding natural cycles, and the quiet strength that comes from adapting without panic. The 7-year drought had been long enough to reshape how communities lived, worked, and thought about their environment. And the return of rain, just as quiet and gradual as the drought's beginning, allowed those same communities to rebuild with confidence shaped by experience. The recovery did not erase the memory of the dryness. It enriched it, reminding people that even long periods of difficulty could be navigated with patience and calm determination. As the land slowly returned to balance, medieval communities entered a new chapter with steadier steps, prepared not just for abundance, but for the cycles of change that defined their world. When the rains finally returned and the land began its slow recovery, many people assumed that life would gradually return to the way it had been before the 7-year drought. But as months passed, communities discovered that the environment, their routines, and their expectations had all shifted in ways that could not simply snap back to an older pattern. The drought had shaped habits that proved more durable than the dryness itself. Just as the drought had unfolded slowly, its aftermath also arrived gradually, revealing how deeply a prolonged environmental change could influence daily life, regional trade, agricultural methods, and even the quiet rhythm of communities for many years to come. The first year after the drought ended was defined by careful observation. Rainfall returned, but it did not instantly erase the long-term effects of 7 dry years. Soil that had been compacted needed time to regain its structure. Even after several months of steady rain, fields did not behave exactly as they had in earlier decades. Farmers observed that deeply dried earth absorbed water slowly, forming a thin, muddy layer on top, while the deeper layers remained firm and resistant. They recognized these signs immediately and adjusted their work accordingly, avoiding heavy plowing until the soil had softened fully. Their experience during the drought had taught them patience, and patience was now the guiding principle of recovery. Crops responded gradually, though cautiously. Farmers planted slightly larger sections of land than during the late drought years, but they still avoided expanding fields too quickly. By now, communities had learned that rushing to regain old patterns was unwise. They chose instead to let the environment signal how much could safely be planted. Early crops grew steadily, supported by renewed moisture, but farmers did not assume abundant harvests. They watched each field closely, noting how soil absorbed water, how stalks responded to sunlight, and how the shade of leaves differed from drought-era variations. These observations guided their decisions more reliably than old assumptions. Over time, harvests did improve. By the second year after the drought, fields displayed a richer color during late spring, a sign that soil was regaining healthy moisture. Plants grew taller, and root vegetables took on deeper firmness. But even as yields improved, people did not abandon the careful methods they had developed during the drought. Seed spacing remained generous. Water collection practices continued. Families still stored grains with the same disciplined methods they had learned when every sack mattered. The habits formed during scarcity became cultural memory, not out of fear, but out of practicality. Wells provided one of the clearest measures of long-term recovery. After years of low water levels, people had learned to monitor wells with remarkable consistency. Even after rainfall increased, communities continued checking levels at dawn and dusk. They built simple wooden markers inside the stone walls of wells to observe changes more easily. These markers became part of the daily rhythm, a quiet reminder of how much had changed during the drought years. By the end of the recovery period, many wells held more water than people had seen in years. But even as they refilled, households maintained the routines that had helped them endure the drought. Water remained a valued resource, treated with respect regardless of abundance. Markets adapted slowly to the post-drought world. Vendors, accustomed to displaying modest quantities, gradually increased their offerings. The return of full baskets and richer produce did not happen overnight. Instead, markets regained vibrancy over several seasons, each one adding slightly more variety. Buyers noticed these changes with quiet appreciation rather than celebration. The memory of smaller markets remained fresh, and people understood that stability mattered more than sudden abundance. Vendors continued arranging goods carefully, using the thoughtful presentation skills refined during the drought. Even when produce grew more plentiful, vendors relied on efficient, resource-conscious practices that had become natural. The pottery trade experienced notable change during the aftermath as well. During the drought, potters had focused on producing sturdy water storage vessels, thick-walled jars, narrow-necked containers, and specialized jugs designed to reduce evaporation. Even after water became more accessible, these vessels remained popular. Households had grown accustomed to using them, appreciating the way they maintained cool water during warm seasons. As a result, potters continued producing similar designs, though now in a greater variety of sizes and decorative styles. These vessels became a lasting legacy of the drought, integrated into daily life even in times of renewed moisture. Livestock routines also shifted in subtle but enduring ways. Shepherds maintained some of the extended grazing paths they had established during the drought. Even though grass returned to fields more reliably, shepherds valued the practice of rotating flocks through wider territories. This method prevented overgrazing and helped fields recover more sustainably. Communities took note of these benefits, recognizing that the adaptations developed during scarcity could strengthen the land during recovery. As a result, grazing management permanently changed in many regions, balancing tradition with insights gained during the drought. In households, recovery took many forms. Families expanded gardens that had been reduced in size during dry years, adding plants that required more water, but they retained efficient watering practices. Clay vessels placed near garden beds became a common sight, allowing water to seep slowly into soil. People reused rainwater more often, designing simple channels and courtyards to direct runoff toward plants. These practices reflected a blend of old routines and new wisdom, a synthesis shaped by necessity but maintained because of their quiet efficiency. The return of rain also affected travel and trade. Routes that had been selected for water availability during the drought remained valued for their reliability. Merchants who had depended on certain inns along these routes continued using them, even when alternative paths became viable again. Water sources along trade routes became well documented, and communities maintained them as rest stops for travelers. These practices improved long-distance commerce, offering a more structured network of travel paths than existed before the drought. Inns themselves experienced renewed activity. After years of careful water management, innkeepers expanded their offerings. With greater access to water, they prepared more varied meals and provided greater comfort to travelers. Yet their efficient methods of managing resources remained unchanged. Many inns maintained the habit of storing water in shaded vessels, preserving it for cooking or washing even when plenty was available. Travelers appreciated the steadiness and predictability shaped by drought-era routines. Despite improvements, communities did not simply forget the drought. Its influence lingered in the way people spoke about weather, planned their activities, and approached each season. When clouds formed in the distance, people observed them with deeper understanding. When early summer arrived, households prepared modest water reserves out of habit, even if rain had been plentiful. When planting season approached, farmers checked soil moisture carefully before committing to large-scale work. These actions were not expressions of worry. They were markers of wisdom passed quietly from one year to the next. Children who had lived through the drought grew into adults who carried its lessons naturally. They recalled the low wells, the dusty fields, and the modest markets of earlier years. These memories shaped their expectations, encouraging them to value careful management even during times of abundance. For them, the post-drought world felt full of possibility, but also deserving of thoughtful stewardship. They carried forward the idea that environments changed over time and that communities needed to adapt calmly rather than rely on assumptions. One of the most significant long-term changes was the way people viewed cooperation. During the drought, neighbors had depended on each other regularly, sharing water, exchanging information, helping with field work, and guiding livestock across shared grazing areas. Even after the drought ended, this cooperative spirit remained strong. Communities recognized that the habits developed during difficult years strengthened their overall resilience. They continued holding informal gatherings to discuss seasonal changes, water levels, and planting conditions. The drought had shown them the value of shared knowledge, and they continued these discussions long after the environment stabilized. Years after the rain returned, the land still carried traces of the 7-year dryness. Some fields took longer to recover fully, especially those where soil had been hardest. Certain riverbeds remained shallower than before, sculpted by years of reduced flow. Forests regrew slowly in patches where understory plants had struggled. These environmental signatures served as reminders of the drought's long reach, shaping how communities planned for the future. Over time, the memory of the drought became a reference point, a quiet part of local history that influenced decisions without dominating daily thoughts. People spoke of the drought not as a dramatic event, but as a long chapter filled with lessons about patience, observation, and community. It became a reminder of how adaptability allowed them to navigate extended change without losing their sense of stability. Perhaps the most enduring aspect of the aftermath was the psychological shift. Before the drought, many communities had assumed that seasonal patterns were stable. After 7 years of dryness and several years of gradual recovery, people approached nature with a more balanced understanding. They recognized that environments changed gradually, sometimes stretching across decades. This understanding gave them a deeper appreciation for calm, measured responses, and reinforced the idea that resilience was built through steady routines, not hurried action. By the time a full generation had passed since the drought's end, the region had returned to a thriving cycle of seasons. Fields grew full. Markets displayed rich variety. Wells held water more deeply than anyone remembered during the drought years. But the habits and insights shaped by the 7-year dryness remained woven into daily life, preserved through quiet routines, shared understanding, and the long memory of a community that had learned to live through profound change with patience and composure. In this way, the drought left its mark not through devastation, but through transformation. It reshaped how people thought, how they worked, and how they cared for their environment. And even as the land recovered, those lessons remained, steady, practical, and quietly enduring. As the years continued after the 7-year drought and the land gradually returned to its familiar rhythm of seasons, communities found themselves carrying a new kind of inheritance. Not an inheritance of material wealth or written records, but one of memory, shaped by the long period of dryness they had lived through. This memory, calm and steady, created a lasting influence on how people raised their children, discussed their past, managed their resources, and structured their understanding of the world. Chapter 7 explores the quiet but powerful way medieval communities preserved the lessons of the drought, embedding them into everyday practices, stories, and shared wisdom. One of the first places where memory settled was within the household. Families who had lived through the drought retained many of the habits they developed out of necessity. Children born during the final years of the dryness grew up seeing containers placed carefully in shaded areas, hearing conversations about checking wells, and watching adults manage resources with measured discipline. Even as water became abundant, these routines continued. Parents did not try to erase memories of the drought. Instead, they folded those memories into daily life, presenting them not as warnings, but as lessons, reminders of how people could stay organized and cooperative when faced with environmental change. Children often learned about the drought through small, practical tasks. They carried water vessels for their families, helped tend to gardens, or assisted in preparing food that required thoughtful water use. Adults explained why certain methods existed, not to create fear, but to pass along the value of careful planning. A child might ask why the narrower clay vessels were still used when larger ones were now available, and an elder would answer with gentle clarity, describing how these vessels had helped conserve water during the dry years. Through such interactions, memory became not just a story but a lived experience, shaping the mindset of a new generation. Communities also preserved memory through shared discussions during market days. The market had always been a center of social exchange, and after the drought, it became a place where older residents occasionally recalled details of how people adapted. Vendors who had lived through the dryness compared how their stalls looked during the drought to how they appeared now. Some described how certain herbs had nearly disappeared from markets due to limited moisture. Others talked about how grain sacks had grown lighter. These conversations, always calm and matter-of-fact, maintained the collective memory of how markets had operated during challenging years. Over time, these exchanges formed a kind of oral history, not formally documented, but deeply embedded in community life. When newcomers asked why certain regions planted their crops differently or why markets displayed goods in more measured arrangements, long-term residents explained how drought-era habits had shaped these traditions. Instead of treating the drought as a dramatic or frightening event, they spoke of it as a long season of adjustment, a time that required patience and steady cooperation. Their tone reflected the dignity with which they had lived through it. Another place where memory settled was in the physical landscape itself. Even after the land recovered, small traces of the drought remained. Certain wells had been deepened during the dry years, and their new construction reflected the changes people had made. Grazing routes established during the drought continued being used, even after fields recovered more fully, because they balanced land use effectively. In some areas, communities had built channels or simple irrigation paths to direct rainfall more efficiently. These features remained, serving as quiet reminders of how people had adapted thoughtfully over the years. Children playing near these landmarks often asked about them, and adults would explain how these structures had supported the community during the dryness. Annual gatherings also played a role in preserving memory. Many medieval communities held seasonal celebrations to mark agricultural milestones. After the drought, these gatherings often included small acknowledgments of the steady resilience people had shown. During harvest festivals, for example, elders might give short remarks noting how much the land had recovered since the dryness. They spoke not dramatically but respectfully, emphasizing the importance of gratitude for predictable seasons and the value of collective effort. These reflections reinforced a sense of continuity between past and present. Some regions incorporated memory into agricultural teaching. Younger farmers learned not only the best times for planting, but also how to recognize early signs of environmental stress, soil losing color, wells dropping sooner than expected, grasses drying earlier in the season. Older farmers shared observations in patient detail, describing patterns they had seen during the drought. Their goal wasn't to create alarm. Instead, they wanted younger generations to understand that land changed slowly and required ongoing attention. These teachings strengthened the bond between people and their surroundings, embedding memory into practical knowledge rather than emotional storytelling. Potters, too, contributed to preserving memory. The sturdy, narrow-necked vessels designed during the drought remained popular long after abundant water returned. Some potters decorated these vessels with modest patterns inspired by the drought years, lines symbolizing rain or shapes representing wells. These designs were subtle and practical, never intended as commemorative art, but they nonetheless served as long-lasting cultural reminders. Buyers appreciated these vessels not only for their usefulness, but also for the quiet story they carried, a story of adaptation and resilience. Inns along trade routes also became keepers of memory. Travelers from distant regions often asked about the long drought, having heard portions of the story from other towns. Innkeepers shared their experiences calmly, describing how they had balanced water use, prepared meals with limited ingredients, and supported travelers who had relied heavily on wells during those years. These shared memories formed a network of stories that stretched across regions, connecting travelers and locals through a common understanding of how long-term environmental challenges shaped community life. The drought also influenced how people interpreted small changes in weather patterns. After enduring 7 years of dryness, communities became more attentive to seasonal variations. When rain fell steadily, they appreciated it with deeper awareness. When sunny periods extended longer than usual, they observed the land more closely. Farmers carefully noted each year's rainfall, comparing it to memories shared by older generations. This attentiveness, shaped by the drought, created a culture of mindful observation that strengthened agricultural decision-making for decades. Memory also appeared in the way communities discussed cooperation. During the drought, people had leaned on each other, sharing water, supporting livestock movement, exchanging market goods, and helping neighbors manage household tasks. These experiences shaped conversations long after the drought ended. Elders often reminded younger generations that cooperation was not merely a response to hardship, but a fundamental part of stable community life. Stories about neighbors working together during dry seasons continued to circulate, reinforcing a collective identity rooted in mutual support. Another important way memory was preserved was through cautionary planning. Even after the land recovered, many communities established larger grain stores than they had kept before the drought. These stores were not treated as emergency reserves, but as practical tools for long-term stability. Towns built larger granaries or improved existing ones to ensure that future generations would have resources if environmental patterns shifted again. This wasn't an emotional reaction. It was a thoughtful measure, shaped by experience, to maintain security without disrupting daily life. Memory also influenced how people taught patience. Children learned that changes in the environment, whether dryness or moisture, unfolded gradually. Adults used the drought as an example when explaining the importance of steady work. They emphasized that challenges were best managed with calm routines rather than rushed responses. This mindset helped strengthen community stability, encouraging younger generations to approach change with the same composure their elders had shown during the drought years. Even storytelling played a role in preserving memory. While medieval communities did not dramatize the drought, they still shared stories centered around practical lessons. A parent might tell a child about a day when the first rain fell after 7 dry years, not to create excitement, but to highlight the importance of recognizing small signs of change. These stories maintained a sense of continuity, connecting new generations to experiences that had shaped their ancestors' lives. As decades passed, the memory of the drought became an essential part of regional identity. Communities remembered not only the dryness, but also the calm resilience with which they had navigated it. The drought became a marker of time, often referenced when older residents compared one period to another. When particularly dry summers came, people recalled how their ancestors had endured far longer stretches. This perspective prevented worry and reinforced the idea that environmental fluctuations were natural parts of life. Ultimately, the memory of the 7-year drought lived not in dramatic accounts or emotional retellings, but in the quiet habits, structures, and routines that shaped daily life long after the dryness had ended. The drought had taught communities to observe the land carefully, manage resources wisely, and value cooperation. These lessons became part of the region's cultural foundation, a steady, practical inheritance that continued guiding people through ordinary seasons and subtle environmental changes. In this way, the drought's legacy endured, not as a story of hardship, but as a story of steady endurance, a memory preserved with clarity, passed with purpose, and integrated into the very structure of community life long after the rains returned. When the drought ended and the land entered a slow but steady recovery, medieval towns did not immediately return to their old ways. Instead, they entered a long period of rebalancing, a careful rebuilding of rhythms that had been shaped by years of dryness. Social life, economic patterns, work routines, and even the way communities interacted with one another gradually shifted, influenced both by returning moisture and by the habits people had formed during years of scarcity. This chapter explores how towns quietly reconstructed their daily structure, how markets evolved during the recovery, and how people rediscovered a stable rhythm rooted in both old traditions and newly learned wisdom. The most immediate sign of rebalancing appeared in the town square. Markets, which had displayed small and carefully arranged selections during the drought, began to look fuller again. But the transition was gradual. Vendors did not suddenly bring overflowing baskets or large quantities of grain. Instead, each new market day added a few more items, slightly larger bundles of herbs, improved vegetables, grains with deeper color, fruits in modest but consistent quantities. Buyers noticed these changes, commenting quietly to one another, acknowledging the progress without rushing into old assumptions. The memory of sparse markets lingered, influencing how people approached each stall. The market layout itself shifted as well. During the drought, vendors had spaced out their goods to make even small quantities look presentable. These habits remained even after abundance returned. Vendors continued using thoughtful arrangements, neat rows, careful spacing, and measured bundles. Buyers found this organization practical and pleasant, and the tradition persisted. The influence of drought-era presentation became part of the town's market identity, shaping a more orderly and intentional environment long after necessity faded. Farmers arriving at the market brought produce shaped by newly balanced soil. The first few seasons after the drought produced smaller harvests than before, but the quality gradually improved as earth regained moisture. Farmers felt encouraged by these changes, but continued to manage their fields cautiously. They expanded slowly, adding new sections of land only after observing how existing fields responded to rainfall patterns. This measured approach gave the land time to recover without being overworked. It also maintained stable supplies for markets without overwhelming them. Markets, in turn, became centers of steady, moderate activity, neither sparse nor overflowing, but balanced. Traders who traveled between towns also contributed to the recovery rhythm. During the drought, trade routes shifted to accommodate reliable water sources. After the drought ended, these same routes remained valuable because communities had invested time in maintaining wells, paths, and inns along them. This created a more organized trade network than existed before. Merchants continued using familiar roads, trusting the reliability established during years of necessity. As trade regained momentum, towns along these routes benefited from increased activity, gaining new economic opportunities while maintaining the slower, measured pace shaped by drought-era habits. Workshops inside towns experienced changes as well. Craftsmen who had adapted their production methods during the drought now reevaluated their roles within a recovering economy. Potters, for example, continued producing sturdy, water-preserving vessels because households still valued them. But as water became more available, potters gradually introduced new shapes and designs: wider bowls, decorative jugs, and larger storage containers. Clients appreciated the return of variety, but the practical vessels developed during the drought remained popular. This blend of old and new demonstrated how recovery created a richer and more diverse economic landscape. Blacksmiths also adjusted to the post-drought world. During the dryness, they had produced tools oriented toward water conservation, agricultural adaptation, and maintenance of wells. After the drought, they continued these practices but also saw renewed demand for traditional tools used during wetter years: plow blades, sickles, and parts for watermills. The return of moisture reopened opportunities for industries that had temporarily slowed. Blacksmiths balanced their production accordingly, blending knowledge gained during the drought with revived techniques from earlier periods. Households throughout towns adjusted their routines slowly. During the drought, people had grown accustomed to completing water-intensive tasks during cooler hours. Even after water became more readily available, families maintained many of these habits. Morning routines remained structured around tasks requiring concentration or physical effort. Afternoons, once challenging due to heat and dryness, gradually became more flexible. Families used this time for work that required less labor, such as mending clothes, preparing ingredients, or maintaining household tools. Even as environmental conditions shifted, the structure of daily life remained influenced by drought-era efficiency. Food preparation also reflected the recovery period. For years, cooks had relied on recipes requiring minimal water and modest ingredients. As more produce became available, kitchens reintroduced long-simmered dishes and meals involving fresh vegetables. But cooks also preserved the efficiency learned during the drought. They prepared meals strategically to reduce waste, reused cooking water when appropriate, and continued drying herbs and fruits for long-term storage. The result was a culinary tradition that combined returning abundance with the practicality shaped by earlier scarcity. Social life in towns regained a fuller rhythm as well. During the drought, gatherings often occurred during cooler times, such as early mornings or late evenings. After the drought, people gradually expanded their schedules, holding communal activities during more varied times of day. Still, the habit of structuring social events around comfortable weather remained. Seasonal gatherings grew more vibrant, markets became louder, and inns filled with livelier conversation. The return of predictable rainfall brought renewed energy to social spaces, yet the calm, steady tone developed during the drought persisted in everyday interactions. One of the most notable developments in the post-drought years was the restoration of town infrastructure. Roads that had become dusty or worn due to prolonged dryness were repaired, strengthened, and in some places lined with new stones. Wells received continued attention, not out of fear of another drought, but because people had learned the value of upkeep. Communities invested in maintaining deeper wells and additional storage areas for water. These improvements created a more resilient infrastructure that supported both everyday life and future challenges. Water systems within towns adapted as well. During the drought, some communities had dug small channels to collect runoff or built simple structures to direct rainfall into storage vessels. After the drought, these systems were not dismantled. Instead, towns improved them, adding stone linings, wooden reinforcements, or clay coatings. These enhancements provided long-term benefits. They reduced erosion, improved water access, and supported larger gardens. As a result, the return of rain did more than restore the old system. It strengthened water management practices developed during years of necessity. Work organizations, such as guilds, also adjusted their practices after the drought. Baker guilds expanded their offerings as grain supplies improved, slowly increasing the variety of breads and baked goods sold. Carpenter guilds took on more construction work as households renovated or expanded their homes. Textile guilds returned to producing garments requiring more water for washing, dyeing, or preparing fibers. These guilds continued to value efficiency and resource management, maintaining systems for training apprentices that included lessons learned during the drought. Schools and learning circles, though informal in many regions, integrated practical knowledge from the drought into their teachings. Young learners were taught how to observe natural patterns, understand soil conditions, and interpret changes in plant growth. Educators emphasized the importance of adapting calmly to environmental shifts. They used the drought as an example of how observation and cooperation could sustain whole communities through long-term challenges. This educational approach created a knowledgeable generation capable of applying lessons from the past to future environmental changes. Towns also experienced changes in how they planned for storage. Before the drought, storage buildings often reflected seasonal habits: grains for winter, preserved goods for certain months, and materials for market days. After the drought, communities recognized the importance of more robust storage solutions. They built larger granaries, reinforced walls, and improved ventilation. Many towns organized shared storage systems where families could keep part of their harvest collectively. This ensured steadier supplies and minimized losses due to pests or spoilage. These developments reflected a long-term strategic mindset shaped by the drought. Trade fairs, which had slowed during the drought due to limited goods, regained their role as important social and economic events. As the land recovered, these fairs grew more vibrant, offering goods from distant regions. People traveled farther to attend them, trusting in the improved water availability along trade routes. Fairs provided not only economic opportunity, but also a sense of celebration, marking the return of familiar traditions. Yet, even these gatherings carried the calm and measured tone of post-drought life. Energetic but never rushed, lively but always grounded in quiet appreciation. The return of dependable rainfall also revived industries that had partially paused during the drought. Watermills, once slowed due to reduced flow, regained strength and supported grain processing more efficiently. Tanneries resumed practices requiring steady water supply. Dye houses reintroduced colors that depended on watering cycles. These industries contributed to a renewed sense of productivity within towns. Their revival brought employment, trade, and the return of certain crafts, strengthening the economic base of communities. Yet, even as life regained momentum, people did not forget the value of moderation. They continued storing water, monitoring wells, rotating fields, and managing livestock thoughtfully. This quiet balance between abundance and caution defined the post-drought period. It ensured that communities remained resilient and prepared, not through fear, but through practical wisdom. By the end of this recovery phase, towns had achieved a new equilibrium, one that combined restored environmental patterns with refined knowledge and mature habits. The drought, though long and challenging, had ultimately strengthened community organization, resource management, trade networks, and daily routines. Life did not return to its pre-drought state. Instead, it evolved into something more stable and intentional. In this rebalanced world, people worked with deeper understanding of their land and their community. Markets thrived with steadiness rather than excess. Fields were cultivated with patience rather than assumption. Water systems were maintained with care rather than urgency. And social life flowed naturally, shaped by both tradition and new practices developed during the 7 dry years. This period of rebalancing demonstrated that recovery was not simply the return of moisture. It was the rebuilding of rhythm. A rhythm shaped by experience, strengthened by cooperation, and carried forward with a calm, confident sense of continuity. Thank you for spending this quiet time exploring how people lived through the long, 7-year drought and how they rebuilt their routines afterward. If tonight's slow journey helped you relax or taught you something new about everyday life in the past, feel free to share your thoughts in the comments. I always enjoy reading what part stood out most to you. If you'd like more calm history to fall asleep to, don't forget to like the video and subscribe so you won't miss the next peaceful story from the past. Rest well, and I'll see you in the next chapter of Forgotten History.